The afternoon heat in Savannah was heavy, the kind of thick Georgia humidity that makes everything move a little slower. It was Father's Day, and I was standing by the kitchen island, plating up the grilled chicken and ribs I'd spent the morning preparing. Through the open window above the sink, I could hear the drone of the air conditioner mixed with the low, arrogant rumble of my son-in-law's voice. Gavin had been drinking steady since he arrived at noon, his laughter getting louder and his comments cutting sharper with every empty bottle. Next him on the patio sat his brother Pierce, lounging back with his boots propped up on my brick planter, feeding Gavin's ego like he always did. I didn't like either of them. Gavin was a high-end real estate developer who wore his wealth like armor, a man who treated everyone around him like hired help. Pierce was his shadow, lazy, entitled, and entirely dependent on his brother's bank account. But I kept my mouth shut. I kept my distance. For 30 years, I had worked hard to build a completely different life down here in the South. The folks in my neighborhood knew me as Thomas Stone, a quiet retired logistics worker who spent his days fixing up old lawnmowers and tending to a vegetable garden. They didn't know about my previous 15 years in Chicago. They didn't know about the cargo docks, the unmarked warehouses, or the cold, hard operations I used to run for people who didn't exist on tax forms. I buried that life deep because I wanted a clean, safe world for my daughter, Chloe. Chloe was my only child, a gentle soul who always tried to see the best in people. When she married Gavin, she thought she was building a family. Instead, she had trapped herself with a bully. For months, I had noticed the subtle signs, the way she jumped when a door slammed, the long sleeves she wore even in the dead of summer, the way she constantly watched Gavin's face to gauge his mood before she spoke. I knew the signs because I had seen men like Gavin my entire life. He was a coward who used control to feel big. Every time I asked Chloe about it, she would force a bright smile and tell me she was just tired, begging me with her eyes not to cause a problem. So for her sake, I played the part of the fragile, oblivious old father. But a man's true nature always comes to light when he thinks nobody is powerful enough to stop him. From the patio, the tone of the conversation shifted. The lazy holiday banter turned sharp. I dropped the serving tongs onto the counter and moved closer to the screen door, my muscles tightening with an old, familiar instinct. Gavin was standing up now, towering over Chloe near the edge of the lawn. His face was flushed red, his chest puffed out as he barked down at her. Chloe was holding her hands up in a pleading gesture, her voice low and trembling as she tried to quiet him down before I noticed. "Just drop it, Chloe!" Gavin shouted, his voice carrying across the yard, completely discarding the fake politeness he usually maintained in my house. "I don't care what your father thinks, and I don't care about this miserable little lunch. We are leaving." Chloe reached out, her fingers gently touching the sleeve of Gavin's expensive polo shirt. She was trying to anchor him, trying to pull him back from the edge of the public rage that was consumed by alcohol. "Gavin, please," she whispered, though the words carried straight through the mesh of my screen door. "My dad is right inside. Just sit back down. We can talk about this in the car." Her gentleness only seemed to infuriate him more. To a man like Gavin, a woman asking for restraint was an insult to his authority. He didn't just push her hand away. In a split second of pure uncontrolled hostility, Gavin spun his entire weight around. He pulled his right arm back and struck Chloe across the face with the back of his hand. The sound of the impact was sickening, a sharp, heavy crack that echoed off the brick walls of my garage. The force of the blow lifted Chloe off her feet, sending her crashing hard onto the concrete edge of the patio. Her sunglasses flew across the yard, shattering against the barbecue grill. She landed on her side, her knees tucked toward her chest, her hands instantly flying up to cover her face as she let out a ragged, choked sob. I stood frozen behind the screen door for a single heartbeat. My brain, which had spent decades processing high-stress situations, locked onto every detail with clinical precision. I looked at Gavin. He didn't look remorseful. He stood over my daughter, chest heaving, adjusting his watch as if he had just completed a minor chore. Then my eyes shifted to Pierce. Pierce was still sitting in the lawn chair. He didn't jump up to help Chloe. He didn't yell at his brother to stop. Instead, he slowly took a sip from his beer bottle, leaned his head back against the cushion, and let out a dry, amused chuckle. A wide, mocking grin spread across his face as he watched my daughter struggle to breathe on the concrete. To Pierce, this wasn't a tragedy. It was entertainment. It was proof of the Sterling family dominance. In that exact moment, the humid Georgia air froze in my lungs. The world around me lost all its color, narrowing down to a sharp, icy focus. For 15 years, I had convinced myself that Thomas Stone was a real person. I had convinced myself that the quiet, gentle gardener who bought groceries at the local market and smiled at his neighbors was who I truly was. But as I watched my daughter's blood begin to drip through her fingers onto my patio, that illusion shattered. The old man died right there in the kitchen. The peaceful retirement I had built was nothing but a house of cards, and Gavin had just kicked it over. The rage that entered me wasn't hot. It was absolute zero. It was the same cold, calculated state of mind that had kept me alive in the worst alleys of Chicago when operations went bloody. My heart rate actually slowed down. My breathing became completely steady. Gavin thought he was the apex predator in this yard. He had no idea he had just stepped into the cage of a monster that had been sleeping for a decade and a half. I pushed the screen door open. I didn't slam it. I didn't rush out into the yard screaming. I stepped onto the patio with a slow, deliberate stride, my boots making an even, rhythmic sound against the concrete. Gavin heard the door and turned around, his arms crossed over his chest. He tried to look big, using his height to intimidate me just like he did with everyone else. "Look, Thomas," he said, his voice dripping with an arrogant, unbothered tone. Chloe slipped. "It's a private matter between a husband and a wife. Don't start making a scene on Father's Day." Pierce stayed in his chair, his feet still propped up, watching me with that same ugly, mocking grin. "Yeah, old man, go back inside and check on the food. Let the adults handle this." I didn't answer them. I didn't even look at them. I walked straight past Gavin, ignoring his presence completely, and knelt down next to Chloe. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She was trembling, holding her face, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't just terrified of Gavin. She saw the look in my eyes, and she knew exactly what that look meant. She knew the history I had tried so hard to hide from her. "Get up, sweetheart," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger or panic. "Go inside the house. Go to my bedroom, lock the door and stay there." "Dad, please," she whispered, her lip bleeding. "Let's just leave, we can go." "Inside, Chloe," I repeated. It wasn't an argument, it was an order. She swallowed hard, stood up, and hurried into the house, locking the door behind her. I stood up slowly, turning around to face the brothers. Gavin was smirked, thinking my quietness was a sign of weakness, a sign of an old man backing down. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his car keys, and tossed them in his hand. "We're leaving," Gavin said, stepping toward me, deliberately brushing his shoulder against mine as he walked past. "Have a nice rest of your Father's Day, Thomas." Pierce finally stood up, throwing his empty beer bottle onto my lawn, laughing under his breath as he followed his brother down the driveway toward their massive high-end pickup truck. I stood on the patio, watching them walk away. My hands were perfectly still. My mind was completely clear. The hesitation, the fear, the desire to live a normal, quiet life, all of it was completely wiped away. I looked at the blood on the concrete, then looked at the two men climbing into their luxury truck, completely unaware of what they had just unleashed. They thought they were dealing with a weak, retired gardener who could be pushed around. They had no idea who I actually was. They had no idea what I had done to survive before I moved to this town. That was the moment the old me came back. To understand how we ended up on that bloody concrete patio, you have to understand how Gavin entered our lives. 3 years ago, Chloe was working as a junior designer at a local architectural firm in downtown Savannah. She was bright, ambitious, and completely transparent about her hopes for the future. Then came Gavin Sterling. He walked into her office representing Sterling Development, a massive real estate company that owned half the commercial property in the county. Gavin didn't just hire her firm. He chose Chloe personally to handle the layouts for his new luxury condominium project. From the very first week, Gavin turned on a level of charm that was almost impossible for a young woman to resist. He was attentive, polite, and completely focused on making Chloe feel like the center of his universe. He sent flowers to her office after a successful presentation. He arranged for private cars to take her to client meetings. When I first met him at a local steakhouse for dinner, he was the model of a traditional, respectful Southern gentleman. He shook my hand with an iron grip, looked me straight in the eye, and spent the evening talking about his respect for hard work and family values. He knew exactly how to play the part. He had the expensive suit, the easy laugh, and an ability to make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. I watched him closely that night, listening to the way he spoke about his future plans, his business, and his affection for my daughter. On the surface, he was everything a father could want for his child. Stable, successful, and deeply invested in her happiness. Chloe was completely smitten. She looked at him like he was a prince who had stepped out of a storybook to rescue her from the daily grind of a regular corporate job. But my old life in Chicago hadn't just taught me how to manage logistics. It had taught me how to read people. I had spent 15 years dealing with smooth-talking operators, corrupt politicians, and con men who could smile while planning your demise. I knew that when a man seems entirely too perfect, it's usually because he has spent a lifetime rehearsing his lines. As Gavin sat across from me, ordering the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu and flashing his bright, confident smile, a small, quiet alarm bell started ringing in the back of my mind. I didn't say anything to Chloe, of course. I didn't want to play the cynical, overprotective father who ruins his daughter's joy based on a gut feeling. I wanted to believe that my past was making me paranoid. I wanted to believe that good, clean success existed in the world, far away from the dark rooms and violent transactions I had left behind. So I kept my mouth shut, smiled back, and let the romance play out. It didn't take long for Chloe to be introduced to the wider Sterling circle. The Sterling family wasn't just wealthy. They were local royalty. Gavin's father had built the foundation of their real estate empire decades ago, leaving a legacy of commercial strip malls, gated communities, and immense political influence throughout the region. They lived in a sprawling estate behind heavy iron gates, throwing charity galas and hosting high society dinners where the city's elite gathered to talk about money and power. When Chloe was invited to these gatherings, she felt like she had entered another world. That was also when I first met Gavin's brother Pierce. If Gavin was the polished executive running the front office, Pierce was the parasitic enforcer who enjoyed the fruits of the family name without doing a single day of actual labor. He drove cars he couldn't afford on his own, wore jewelry that screamed for attention, and possessed an insufferable attitude of absolute entitlement. He followed Gavin everywhere, acting as his hype man and echo chamber. Together, the brothers walked through life as if the laws of the state and the rules of basic human decency simply didn't apply to them. They were untouchable, backed by an army of corporate attorneys and a family bank account that could bury any problem in paperwork. But as the wedding approached, the cracks in Gavin's charming persona began to show. The first red flag happened at a small engagement dinner. The waiter had accidentally brought Gavin the wrong vintage of wine. It was a minor mistake, the kind of thing a normal person points out with a quiet word and a smile. Instead, Gavin's face altered instantly. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by a cold, sharp arrogance. He didn't just ask for a replacement. He humiliated the young waiter in front of the entire table, using a calm, vicious tone that was designed to make the man feel completely worthless. Pierce sat right next to him, snickering and tossing in small insults of his own to keep the fire burning. I sat at the end of the table, watching the entire exchange. I looked at Chloe. She had her head down, her cheeks flushing pink, as she tried to ignore the cruelty happening right in front of her. When the waiter left, Gavin turned back to the table, his charming smile returning in a split second, as if he hadn't just degraded a human being for a minor oversight. That was the moment I knew Gavin wasn't just arrogant, he was a controller. He was the kind of man who needed absolute dominance over his environment, and if he couldn't get it through status, he would get it through intimidation. A week later, Chloe mentioned that Gavin had asked her to leave her job at the architectural firm once they married. He claimed he wanted to take care of her, that she didn't need to stress herself with a career anymore. But I knew better. He didn't want to take care of her. He wanted to remove her financial independence. He wanted to make sure that her survival was entirely dependent on his approval. After the wedding, the isolation happened so slowly that Chloe didn't even realize she was being locked in a cage. Gavin bought a massive home in an exclusive, secluded neighborhood miles away from downtown. It was a beautiful house, but it was miles away from any of Chloe's childhood friends. Next, Gavin started expressing dislike for her social circle. He would drop casual comments about how her friends were just using her for her new status, or how they didn't match the lifestyle they were trying to build. Within a year, Chloe had stopped responding to group texts. She stopped going out for coffee. Her entire world had shrunk down to Gavin, Pierce, and the walls of that big empty house. Every time I visited them, I could see the light fading from my daughter's eyes. The confident, ambitious young woman who used to talk passionately about architecture was gone. In her place was a quiet, hesitant wife who constantly walked on eggshells, measuring every word before she spoke it aloud. If Gavin entered the room, she would sit up straighter, adjusting her posture and checking her phone to make sure she hadn't missed a call or a text from him. The worst part was the physical transformation. Chloe started wearing long, heavy sweaters and long-sleeve shirts, even when the Georgia summer heat was hitting 95 degrees. When I pointed it out one afternoon while we were sitting on my porch, she quickly pulled her sleeves down over her wrists, looked away, and claimed she was just sensitive to the air conditioning. I saw the flash of absolute panic in her eyes when I asked the question. I knew right then what was happening. I knew she was covering up bruises, hiding the physical evidence of the monster she had married. It broke my heart. It tore me apart inside to know that my beautiful, innocent daughter was suffering, and she was keeping it a secret because she was too ashamed to admit the truth to her father. She thought she was protecting me. She thought her old, retired dad couldn't handle the reality of the situation, or that the wealthy Sterling family would destroy us both if we tried to fight back. She didn't know about my past. She didn't know that the gentle old man who grew tomatoes in his backyard had spent 15 years working alongside some of the most ruthless men in the country. I stayed quiet because I knew that if I moved too fast, if I confronted Gavin without a plan, he would simply pack Chloe up, move her away, and cut off my access to her completely. I had to wait for the right moment. I had to wait for the evidence to present itself so clearly that Chloe couldn't deny it anymore. That was the true tragedy of it all. Chloe had married a man she thought would protect her and give her a beautiful life. Instead, she had handed her heart to a sociopath who enjoyed crushing her spirit piece by piece, while his brother Pierce clapped from the sidelines. They thought their wealth made them gods. They thought they could treat my daughter like a piece of property because they had a famous last name and a multi-million-dollar business. They had no idea that the trap they were building for Chloe was actually the very thing that would bring their entire world crashing down. The transition from a fairy tale romance to a prison sentence didn't happen overnight. Gavin was far too calculated for that. He handled the destruction of Chloe's independence with the same strategic planning he used for his real estate acquisitions. It began with her phone. In the first few months of their marriage, Gavin bought her a brand new top-tier device linked directly to his corporate family plan. He claimed it was a gift, a way to make sure she always had the best technology available. But the reality was far more restrictive. He tracking her location through the family account app, checking her mileage, and monitoring how long she spent at the grocery store or visiting her mother's old friends. Slowly, the people who had known Chloe her entire life began to drop away. If her childhood friend called her on a Friday evening, Gavin would sit on the couch right next to her, staring at her face, listening intently to every word, and sighing loudly with irritation until Chloe cut the conversation short. Later, he would whisper poison into her ear, telling her that her friends were jealous of her wealth, that they only wanted to use her for her new connections, and that they didn't appreciate the high society lifestyle the Sterlings were building. He made her feel guilty for wanting a life outside of his presence. I remember the exact weekend the isolation became undeniable. It was my birthday, and I had organized a small family dinner at a local seafood diner down by the marina. Chloe had promised she would be there by 6. At 5:30, my phone rang. It was Gavin, his voice completely smooth, dripping with artificial regret. He told me that Chloe had developed a sudden, severe migraine and couldn't leave the house. He said he was going to stay home to nurse her back to health, thanking me for understanding. But I knew my daughter. Chloe wouldn't miss my birthday for a headache. The next morning, I drove out to their big estate under the pretense of dropping off some leftovers. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Chloe sitting on the back patio alone. When she saw my car, she didn't run out to greet me with a hug like she used to. Instead, she froze, looking back toward the house with a look of absolute dread on her face, checking to see if Gavin's truck was in the garage. She had been conditioned to look at her own father as a potential trigger for her husband's anger. The emotional manipulation was paired with absolute financial dominance. When Gavin convinced Chloe to leave her architectural firm, he promised her a life of luxury where she would never have to worry about a single bill. He handed her a black credit card with his corporate logo stamped on the front. But that card wasn't a tool of freedom, it was a leash. Every single transaction Chloe made went directly to Gavin's phone as an instant notification. If she spent $20 at a coffee shop, he would call her within 5 minutes, asking who she was with and why she was spending money without consulting him first. He didn't stop there. He refused to put her name on the deed of their home, and he kept all their savings in private accounts that required his personal signature to access. If Chloe wanted cash for something as simple as buying a birthday gift for me, she had to ask him for an allowance like a child. He would make her wait days, questioning her about the necessity of the purchase, reminding her constantly that he was the sole provider, and that everything she enjoyed, from the clothes on her back to the roof over her head, belonged entirely to him. Pierce was a constant participant in this financial humiliation. He would come over to the house for dinner, sit at their expensive dining table, and make loud jokes about how lucky Chloe was that a Sterling had rescued her from her modest, middle-class background. Gavin would laugh along, pouring more wine, while Chloe sat silently at the end of the table, staring down at her plate. They were systematically breaking her down, destroying her self-worth, until she truly believed that she was completely helpless without them. Whenever I tried to gently bring up the topic of their finances during my brief visits, Gavin would swiftly intervene. He would talk over Chloe, flashing his bright executive smile and steering the conversation toward his latest multi-million-dollar land acquisition. He wanted me to see him as an untouchable titan of industry, a man so wealthy and successful that any complaint from his wife would look like ungrateful complaints. He was hiding his cruelty behind a wall of dollar bills, using his family's massive wealth as a shield against any outside scrutiny. As the months rolled on, the emotional damage turned into physical concealment. I started noticing changes in the way Chloe carried herself whenever Gavin was around. She walked with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself look smaller, trying to occupy as little space as possible so she wouldn't draw his attention. Her bright, beautiful laughter, the sound that used to fill my house when she was growing up, had completely vanished. It was replaced by a quiet, strained compliance. The turning point for me happened just 3 weeks before that fateful Father's Day barbecue. Chloe had dropped by my house unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon while Gavin was out of town on a business trip in Atlanta. It was the first time in over a year that she had come over without his permission. We sat at the kitchen table, and as I handed her a glass of sweet tea, her hand brushed against the edge of the wooden table. She winced sharply, dropping the glass, her face draining of color. Before she could pull her hand back, I reached out and gently moved the fabric of her long sleeve. There, resting against her pale skin, was a band of dark yellowish bruises right around her wrist. It looked exactly like the imprint of a heavy hand gripping her with immense force. I felt a cold shock travel straight down my spine. The room felt completely silent. "Chloe," I said, my voice shaking with a protective anger I hadn't felt in 15 years. "Tell me what he did to you." She instantly pulled her arm back, tugging the fabric down to cover her skin, her eyes wide with a frantic panic. "Nothing, Dad. I swear it was just an accident. I fell while I was cleaning the stairs. Gavin wasn't even there. Please, you have to believe me. Don't say anything to him. If you confront him, it will only make things 100 times worse." She was begging me with her eyes, her lower lip trembling as she fabricated the story. She was terrified. She was trapped in a cycle of fear, hiding the daily torment she was enduring because she genuinely believed the Sterling family was too powerful to stop. She thought her retired old father would get hurt if he tried to stand up to a wealthy real estate mogul. Looking at her bruised wrist, a horrible clarity settled over me. I realized right then that she hadn't just been having a tough marriage. She had been suffering in absolute silence for years. Every excuse she had made, every missed family dinner, every long-sleeve shirt in the heat of summer, it wasn't negligence. It was survival. While I had been peacefully tending to my garden, my only child was living in a domestic war zone, dealing with a monster who used her as a punching bag to feed his own twisted ego. My heart didn't harden. It turned to steel. I realized that my attempt to leave my past behind in Chicago had blinded me to the danger right in front of my face. I had tried so hard to be a normal, peaceful citizen that I had allowed a coward to abuse my daughter under my own nose. I didn't push her any further that afternoon. I nodded, forced a gentle smile, and told her I believed her. But internally, the calculation had already begun. The quiet gardener was officially gone. I knew I couldn't just throw a punch or yell at him. A man like Gavin would just use his lawyers to bounce back. I needed a complete, systematic destruction. I just needed one clear, undeniable moment to act, and Gavin was about to give it to me. To understand the call I was about to make, you have to understand who I was before I became Thomas Stone, the quiet gardener from Savannah. 30 years ago, I didn't live in a peaceful neighborhood. I lived in a world where names were never written down and faces were intentionally forgotten. In Chicago, I was known as a specialist in high-risk logistics. On paper, I managed shipping routes, warehouse inventories, and cross-country transport networks. In reality, I moved assets for people who operated entirely outside the boundaries of ordinary society. The men I worked for didn't run traditional corporations. They were ruthless organizations that controlled entire industries through fear, leverage, and absolute discipline. My job was to ensure that their highly sensitive cargo arrived at its destination without a single glitch, bypassing federal checkpoints, local authorities, and rival factions. In that line of work, a single mistake didn't mean losing a bonus. It meant a permanent disappearance. I spent 15 years operating in those frozen industrial spaces, dealing face-to-face with individuals who viewed human life as a numbers game. I survived because I was cold, calculated, and completely reliable. I didn't get emotional, I didn't ask unnecessary questions, and I kept my mouth shut. I learned how to read a room in a split second, how to spot a trap before it snapped closed, and how to dismantle an adversary's entire operation without ever firing a single shot. I saw things that would keep an ordinary man awake for the rest of his days. Brutal power struggles, cold-blooded betrayals, and the systematic erasure of people who thought they were untouchable. But that kind of environment leaves a permanent stain on your soul. You spend every single second looking over your shoulder, checking your rearview mirror, and wondering if the man shaking your hand is planning to slide a blade into your ribs. It's a heavy, exhausting way to live, and after 15 years of navigating those dark waters, I looked at my young daughter Chloe and realized I couldn't let that world consume her. I needed an exit. I needed to build an iron wall between my child and the violence that defined my daily existence. Walking away from that network wasn't as simple as submitting a resignation letter. In my world, you didn't just retire. You either died, went to prison, or made yourself so entirely useless that they let you slip away. I chose a different route. I engineered a flawless disappearance. Over the course of 12 grueling months, I slowly shifted assets, erased my digital footprints, and transferred ownership of my legitimate front businesses to my associates. I changed my identity, bought a modest home in Georgia under the name Thomas Stone, and cut ties with every single contact I had ever made. It was a heavy sacrifice. I had to abandon the immense wealth I had accumulated, leaving millions of dollars behind in untraceable accounts, because carrying that kind of cash would have left a trail straight to my daughter. I traded a life of luxury and absolute authority for a small pension, a rusty lawnmower, and a quiet plot of land in Savannah. I did it willingly because I wanted Chloe to grow up around normal, decent citizens. I wanted her to believe that the world was a safe, fair place, completely free from the cold calculations that kept me alive in the North. For 30 years, the deception worked flawlessly. I forced myself to become a gentle, unassuming old man. I learned how to discuss the weather with neighbors, how to haggle over the price of fertilizer at the local co-op, and how to smile politely when arrogant young men like Gavin Sterling spoke down to me. I had buried the survival instincts, the clinical precision, and the terrifying capacity for destruction that I had honed in those Chicago warehouses. I thought I had successfully paid my debt to the past. But you can never truly run away from who you are. The dark knowledge doesn't just vanish because you start a garden. I still knew how to destroy a man's financial infrastructure. I still knew how to trace shell companies, how to exploit regulatory loopholes, and how to trigger an institutional investigation that could dismantle a multi-million-dollar corporation in a matter of hours. More importantly, I still possessed the private emergency contact of the one man who owed me his life, a man who had risen to become one of the most powerful invisible fixers in the country. That man was Donovan. 15 years ago, right before I finally broke away from the Chicago network for good, a massive shipment of sensitive government hardware went missing from a secured rail yard. A rival organization had set up a perfect frame job, positioning Donovan to take the absolute fall for the theft. Federal agents were closing in, and a hit squad had already been dispatched to eliminate him before he could speak to a grand jury. I was the chief logistics officer on duty that night. Instead of locking the gates and letting the wolves clear the board, I utilized an unlisted cargo route, intercepted Donovan in a freezing rainstorm, and smuggled him out of Illinois in the back of an unmarked container truck. I saved his life, his reputation, and his freedom. Before we parted ways at a truck stop in Indiana, Donovan looked at me with eyes that had seen absolute brutality and said, "Thomas, you only get one call, no matter where, no matter when. You call me, and whatever problem you have ceases to exist." Donovan wasn't a criminal who operated in the alleys. He was an elite corporate operator who worked in the highest corridors of institutional power. He was a master of systemic destruction, a man who could command forensic accountants, federal agencies, and media executives with a single phone call. For 15 years, I kept that 10-digit number buried in the deepest drawer of my heavy oak desk, praying to God that I would never be desperate enough to dial it. I didn't want to owe that world anything ever again. I didn't want to invite the shadow back into my house. But as I stood on my porch watching Gavin and Pierce drive away after striking my daughter, the hesitation evaporated. The brothers thought they were untouchable because they had local connections, wealthy parents, and a prominent real estate name in a mid-sized southern town. They thought their money was a shield. They had no idea that the quiet old retiree they had just assaulted had access to a level of power that could crush their entire family dynasty without a second thought. Gavin wanted to play a game of dominance. He was about to find out that the man he had just pushed around was backed by the most dangerous network he would ever encounter. The roaring engine of Gavin's high-end pickup truck echoed through the quiet suburban street as he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. Tires squealed against the hot asphalt, leaving dark streaks of rubber right at the edge of my driveway. Through the tinted glass of his passenger window, I could see Pierce leaning back against the headrest, laughing hysterically, completely amused by the entire encounter. They drove away with their heads held high, convinced they had successfully put a fragile old man in his place. To them, I was just a harmless aging retiree who would spend the rest of his evening sweeping up broken glass and comforting a weeping daughter. I stood perfectly still on the concrete patio, my eyes fixed on the empty space where their truck had been parked just moments before. The afternoon sun was still beating down on the backyard, the grill was still hot, and the food I had spent hours preparing sat entirely abandoned on the counter. Everything looked like a normal holiday weekend, but the reality of my world had completely shifted. The warm, peaceful life I had cultivated over 30 years felt like a distant memory. I could feel the cold, mechanical precision of my former life taking full possession of my mind, pushing aside the gentle father I had tried so hard to become. I turned around and walked back into the house, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. The interior of my home was quiet, save for the faint, muffled sound of Chloe sobbing from behind the locked door of my bedroom down the hall. Every sob cut through me like a razor blade, reinforcing the absolute necessity of what I was about to do. I didn't rush. I didn't let adrenaline dictate my movements. When you are preparing to dismantle a multi-million-dollar empire, haste is your greatest enemy. You need clarity, you need focus, and above all, you need an unwavering commitment to total annihilation. I walked into the living room and approached the old, heavy oak desk that sat in the corner by the window. This desk had been with me since my final days in Chicago, a massive piece of furniture that held the few remaining fragments of a life I had tried to completely erase. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my ring of keys, and selected the smallest tarnished brass key at the very end of the chain. I knelt down beside the desk and inserted the key into the brass lock of the bottom drawer. It turned with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the empty living room. I pulled the deep drawer open. On top lay decades of ordinary life, old property tax receipts, instruction manuals for gardening equipment, and faded photographs of Chloe when she was a little girl. But underneath those layers of peaceful retirement, taped securely to the very bottom of the wooden frame, was a small, flat compartment. I reached in and pulled out a worn, black, leather-bound address book. It was tiny, small enough to fit into the palm of my hand, but it carried enough leverage to shatter lives. I wiped a thin layer of dust from the cover, opened the book, and flipped past dozens of names that had been crossed out over the years, names of associates who had ended up in federal penitentiaries or cold ground. On the final page, written in fading blue ink, was a single name and a 10-digit number: Donovan. I sat down in the leather chair, picked up my cell phone, and stared at the screen for a moment. I knew that once I hit dial, there was no turning back. The wall I'd built between my daughter and the dark forces of my past would be completely demolished. But as I looked out the window and saw the drops of Chloe's blood still drying on the concrete patio, every ounce of hesitation vanished. Gavin Sterling thought his wealth made him a king in this town. He was about to learn what real power looked like. My fingers were perfectly steady as I input the numbers. I pressed the call button and placed the phone to my ear. It didn't ring like a normal line. The signal routed through 3 different encrypted servers, a security measure Donovan maintained to keep his location completely invisible to federal wiretaps. The line clicked. It rang once, twice. Then the ringing stopped, replaced by a heavy, absolute silence. No one spoke. In our world, you didn't say hello. You waited to see if the person on the other end knew the protocol. Donovan, I said, my voice dropping into a low, flat register that I hadn't used in 15 years. It's Thomas Stone. I'm calling in my marker. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The quiet was absolute, the kind of silence that only exists when a man of immense power is shifting his entire focus to a ghost he thought he would never hear from again. When Donovan finally spoke, his voice was smooth, raspy, and entirely devoid of surprise. Thomas, Donovan said, the audio crisp despite the encrypted routing. I wondered if this day would ever come. 15 years is a long time to stay dead. I assume you aren't calling me to talk about the weather in Georgia. My daughter was assaulted today, I replied, my voice completely level, stripped of any hot anger, leaving only cold utility. A man named Gavin Sterling, he and his brother Pierce. They run a major real estate development firm down here. They think they own the county. They think their money makes them untouchable. I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard tapping on Donovan's end. He didn't ask for details about the assault. He didn't offer empty condolences. He was an operator. He only cared about the logistics of the target. Sterling Development, Donovan muttered, reading information off a secure monitor in real time. I see them. Commercial properties, municipal contracts, local political funding. On paper, they look substantial. In reality, they are over-leveraged. They've been cutting corners on material costs, and they have 3 major offshore accounts that wouldn't survive an audit by the regulatory commissions. I don't just want them broken, Donovan, I said, staring out the window at the empty driveway. I want them entirely dismantled. I want their assets frozen, their reputation destroyed, and their freedom taken away. I want them to look at everything they've built and watch it turn to dust. And I want them to know it happened because they laid a hand on my family. Consider it done, Donovan replied, his tone entirely casual, as if I had just asked him to clear a minor shipping delay at the Chicago docks. The machinery is already moving. By tomorrow morning, federal auditors will be sitting in their corporate offices. By the end of the week, their investors will flee, their bank accounts will be locked, and the authorities will be executing warrants for corporate fraud. They won't even have enough cash left to hire a local defense attorney. Thank you, Donovan, I said. We are even now, Thomas, Donovan said quietly, a grim finality in his voice. Give your daughter my regards. As for the sitter, them already buried. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, placed it back on the desk, and took a deep, steady breath. The trap was set. The brothers were driving home right now, laughing, celebrating their hollow victory, completely unaware that the countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. I walked down the quiet hallway, my boots heavy against the floorboards, carrying a warmth that felt entirely foreign to the cold calculation currently ruling my mind. I stopped outside my bedroom door. The house was dead silent except for the faint, ragged breathing on the other side of the wood. I knocked gently, 3 soft raps. Chloe, I said, keeping my voice soft, letting the hard edge of the old Chicago operator vanish entirely. It's Dad, he's gone. You're safe. A moment later, the brass lock clicked. The door swung open slowly and my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Chloe stood there, her hair disheveled, her face swollen where Gavin's hand had struck her, and her eyes wide with a deep, systemic terror. The absolute exhaustion of keeping a secret for 3 years seemed to collapse her posture all at once. As soon as she looked into my eyes, the remaining walls she had built around her torment crumbled. She stepped forward, buried her face into my chest, and let out a broken, shuddering sob that tore through the quiet of the house. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly, guiding her over to the edge of the mattress. We sat down together in the dim light of the bedroom. For several long minutes, no words were spoken. There were only her tears, her hands trembling against my shirt, and the crushing weight of father realizing the true depth of his failure to protect his only child. I rubbed her back, whispering gentle reassurances, waiting for the storm of her initial panic to subside, so she could finally speak the truth she had been forced to carry alone. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her trembling hand, she looked at me with a profound, aching vulnerability. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't want you to see this. I didn't want you to know what my life has actually been like." "You don't ever have to apologize to me, sweetheart," I said gently, looking at the dark bruising already forming on her cheek. "Tell me everything. No more hiding, no more protection. Tell me what he did." Chloe took a deep, trembling breath, staring down at her tightly clasped hands as the truth finally began to spill out. It hadn't just been an occasional argument or a sudden burst of temper. Gavin had spent the last 3 years systematically dismantling every piece of her sanity. It started just months after their wedding, inside the walls of that isolated estate. If she didn't answer his calls on the first ring, he would accuse her of betraying him, spending hours interrogating her until she was weeping and begging for forgiveness for a mistake she hadn't even made. "He made me feel like I was losing my mind, Dad," Chloe whispered, a fresh tear tracking down her bruised cheek. "If I confronted him about his temper, he would tell me I was imagining things, that I was being unstable, and that no one else would ever believe me because his family was too important. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him, he would use his family's attorneys to tie me up in court for the rest of my life. He said he would make sure I ended up with absolutely nothing, not even my dignity." But the psychological control quickly escalated into explicit threats against the only thing she had left: me. Gavin knew that I was her entire world. He used that devotion as an iron leash. "That was why I could never tell you," she choked out, her grip tightening on my arm. "A year ago, when I threatened to pack my bags and come stay with you, Gavin got incredibly cold. He sat me down and told me that if I ever tried to run to you, he would ruin you. He said he would hire people to tie you up in lawsuits, destroy your reputation in this town, and make sure you lost your house. He told me you were just an old, fragile man who wouldn't survive a real fight with his family. I stayed to keep you safe, Dad. Every time he put his hands on me, I just closed my eyes and told myself that as long as I took it, he would leave you alone." The horror deepened as she spoke about Pierce. Gavin's brother wasn't just a bystander. He was an active enforcer of the family dynamics. Whenever Chloe tried to defend herself or lock herself in a room to escape Gavin's rage, Pierce would be right there, standing in the hallway, blocking her path, or laughing as Gavin threw her belongings onto the floor. Pierce would remind her constantly of her place, telling her she was just a middle-class girl who should be grateful for the Sterling name. They operated as a unit, a duo of absolute arrogance that enjoyed crushing her spirit for their own amusement. Listening to her words, a profound, agonizing pain ripped through my chest. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful, brilliant soul who had sacrificed her own safety, her own body, and her own sanity to protect a retired old man who she thought was helpless. She had taken his blows and carried his bruises, all because she loved me too much to let the Sterling Empire target my quiet life. The sheer weight of her love, paired with the absolute monstrosity of what they had done to her, broke something deep inside me. Tears finally spilled over my own eyes, hot and heavy, tracking down the wrinkles of my face. I pulled her back into a fierce, protective embrace, my hands shaking as I held her head against my shoulder. "Oh, Chloe, my sweet girl," I choked out, the emotion completely overtaking my voice. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry that I wasn't there to stop it. I was supposed to protect you. I left Chicago to give you a safe life, and instead, I let you walk right into a den of wolves." "You didn't know, Dad," she sobbed, her hands clutching the back of my shirt like she was a little girl again, hiding from a thunderstorm. "Nobody knew. They are too powerful. There's nothing we can do to stop them." I pulled back just enough to look her directly in the eyes. I gripped her shoulders with a firm, steady pressure, letting the raw intensity of my past bleed through into my gaze. The tears stopped. The sorrow remained, but it was completely encased in an unyielding wall of absolute certainty. "Look at me, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that brooked no argument. "Listen to me very carefully. They are not powerful. They are just cowards hiding behind a pile of money, and their money cannot save them from me. You are never going back to that house. You are never going to see his face again. You are safe now, and I promise you, on your mother's memory, that Gavin and Pierce Sterling will pay for every single tear you have cried." She looked at me, her eyes wide, sensing a shift in my demeanor that she couldn't quite explain. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at a frail, retired gardener. She was looking at the man I used to be, the man who moved in the shadows of Chicago, the man who handled the most dangerous forces in the country without a single flinch. She didn't know the details of my past, but she could feel the absolute authority in my words. The panic in her breathing began to slow, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of relief. The nightmare wasn't just ending. The tables were turning, and for the first time in 3 years, Chloe wasn't facing the monsters alone. The passage of time in the wake of that phone call didn't feel normal. It moved with a clinical, freezing precision. Exactly 20 minutes after the line with Donovan went completely dead, a low, rhythmic rumble began to vibrate through the quiet asphalt of our suburban street. It wasn't the sound of a single vehicle. It was a synchronized, heavy convoy. I stood by the large front window of my living room, my arm gently resting around Chloe's shoulders, watching as a fleet of 6 identical, pitch-black utility vehicles rounded the corner in a tight, military-style formation. These weren't local authorities. They bore no bright flashing lights, no loud sirens, and no local county markings. They moved with an eerie, silent authority that instantly altered the atmosphere of the neighborhood. The dark windows completely obscured the occupants, but the sheer weight of their presence communicated a terrifying truth. The machinery of institutional power had officially arrived. Neighbors began stepping onto their front porches, pointing and whispering, their faces filled with confusion as the convoy bypassed my driveway entirely, accelerating with purposeful intent toward the exclusive gated community where Gavin and Pierce resided just 3 miles up the road. "Dad?" Chloe whispered, her grip tightening on my waist as she watched the vehicles disappear past the tree line. "What is happening? Who are those people?" "Those are the consequences, sweetheart," I said softly, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Gavin thought he could use his status to isolate you from the world. He didn't realize that some forces operate completely outside of his little circle. Come on, put on your coat. We are going to go watch an empire fall." I guided her out to my modest sedan. My hands were perfectly relaxed on the steering wheel as I backed out of the driveway. For 30 years, I had driven this vehicle like an old man, cautious and slow. But today, the calculation in my mind was sharp. I knew exactly what Donovan was capable of executing when a marker was called in. He didn't just file paperwork. He staged theatrical public executions of corporate empires. By the time we reached the perimeter gates of the Sterling neighborhood, the illusion of their security had already been completely shattered. When my sedan pulled up to the perimeter of the exclusive neighborhood, the heavy iron security gates were already pinned wide open, guarded by men in tactical gear who didn't even look at us as we passed. We drove up the winding hill, stopping 100 yards away from Gavin's massive estate. The scene unfolding on the manicured lawns was total chaos. The black vehicles had completely blocked the driveway, tracking thick mud across the pristine, expensive landscaping. Teams of federal agents in dark jackets with gold lettering were already swarming the property, moving with an unstoppable systematic efficiency. From our position on the street, we could hear the heavy, metallic thud of the front door being breached. Within seconds, agents began pouring out of the house, carrying stacks of cardboard archive boxes, high-end desktop computers, and thick ledgers of financial documentation. They weren't just searching for evidence. They were emptying the entire structure, stripping the brothers of every piece of data they had ever used to exploit this town. Gavin's prized collection of luxury sports cars, the vehicles he used as a physical manifestation of his unearned ego, were being systematically targeted. Flatbed tow trucks backed up onto the grass, their heavy chains clinking loudly as operators hooked them to the axles of his pristine German convertibles. Neighbors stood in small, stunned clusters along the sidewalk, holding up their phones, recording every single second of the multi-million-dollar destruction. The carefully cultivated image of the Sterling family dynasty was being utterly obliterated in broad daylight, turned into a public spectacle for the very community they used to look down upon. I kept my car engine idling, looking over at Chloe. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes reflecting the bright, harsh glare of the flashing utility lights. For 3 years she had viewed this house as an inescapable prison, an untouchable fortress backed by unlimited capital. Now she was watching it get dismantled in less than half an hour by an authority that didn't care about the Sterling name, their local political donations, or their corporate influence. The absolute terror that had defined her existence for years was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the sheer adrenaline-fueled realization that the monsters were completely outmatched. The climax of the raid came when the front doors flew open once more, and the brothers were marched out into the blinding afternoon sun. Gavin came first, his expensive silk shirt wrinkled and torn at the collar, his hands secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. The arrogant executive smirk that he had worn just 20 minutes ago in my driveway was completely gone. His face was flushed crimson, a mixture of unbridled fury and absolute panic as 2 federal agents guided him down the stone steps. Behind him came Pierce, his eyes darting frantically around the neighborhood, shouting empty legal threats at the officers, his voice cracking with the realization that his family's influence had completely vanished. "You can't do this!" Gavin screamed, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns as he struggled against the grip of the agents. "Do you know who I am? Call my attorney. Call the mayor's office." The agents didn't reply. They didn't even blink. They pushed him toward the rear of a waiting transport vehicle with an absolute lack of emotion. As they reached the edge of the driveway, Gavin's eyes scanned the crowd of watching neighbors, searching for any sign of support. Instead, his gaze locked directly onto my sedan parked at the curb. He saw me. I rolled my window down just an inch, sitting perfectly still, my expression completely flat and unreadable. Next to me, Chloe sat with her head held high, looking down at her captor with a quiet, undeniable dignity. Gavin froze, his chest heaving as the pieces of the puzzle instantly connected in his mind. He remembered my warning. He remembered the cold, unwavering certainty in my eyes when I told him he would lose everything. In that single fleeting moment, the arrogance completely died in his eyes, replaced by a deep, primitive horror. He finally realized that the quiet, fragile old gardener he had assaulted wasn't a victim at all. I was the architect of his absolute ruin. The agents pushed him into the back of the dark vehicle, and the heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud. The convoy began to pull away, moving down the street in the same tight formation, leaving behind a ruined house, a destroyed reputation, and an empty driveway. I rolled my window back up, shifted the car into drive, and slowly steered away from the chaos. The battle inside the neighborhood was over, but the message had been delivered with absolute clarity. The Sterling brothers were gone, and my daughter was finally free. The physical arrests at the estate were merely the opening salvo. The true devastation was taking place within the digital architecture of the financial world. By the following morning, the proprietary software systems that managed the entirety of Sterling development were completely locked down by regulatory commissions. Donovan's network had delivered a mountain of undeniable, cross-referenced evidence directly to the desks of federal prosecutors. Decades of systematically falsified building inspections, bribery of municipal officials, and massive offshore tax evasion schemes were laid bare in a matter of hours. The brothers had built their entire empire on a foundation of absolute deception, believing that their local prominence made them immune to scrutiny. They had spent years over-leveraging their properties, using shell companies to hide millions in debt, while presenting fraudulent, inflated balance sheets to commercial banks to secure even larger loans. Now the curtain had been pulled back with clinical precision. Forensic accountants had mapped out every single hidden transaction, every illegal payout, and every secret account from the Bahamas to Switzerland. As the details of the institutional fraud began to solidify, the corporate headquarters of Sterling Development became a ghost town. Federal agents carried out boxes of physical files, while the remaining executives and mid-level managers scrambled to secure their own legal protection. No one was trying to save the company. Everyone was trying to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of the Sterling name. The corporate structure didn't just fracture. It dissolved entirely, proving that without their stolen capital and unearned influence, the brothers were absolutely nothing. By noon, the institutional collapse became a public execution. Donovan's media contacts ensured that the unsealed indictments weren't just buried in legal databases. They were pushed directly to the front page of every major financial news outlet and local television network. Captivating headlines detailed the staggering scope of the corporate corruption, broadcasting the brothers' mugshots alongside footage of the raid. The narrative was definitive, painting Gavin and Pierce not as successful entrepreneurs, but as fraudulent operators who had systematically exploited the local economy for personal luxury. The media exposure triggered an immediate, uncontrollable panic among their primary investors. Institutional backers who had poured millions into Sterling development projects realized their capital was tied up in a massive federal investigation. Phone lines at the corporate office rang off the hook as partners desperately demanded the immediate withdrawal of their funds, only to discover that every single domestic and international bank account associated with the Sterling name had been frozen by federal order. The realization set in rapidly. The money was completely gone, locked away in government custody. Simultaneously, the elite defense attorneys who had previously protected the family from minor local liabilities began to vanish. When the primary law firm reviewed the overwhelming volume of federal evidence and realized that the brothers no longer possessed the liquid capital to pay their massive retainer fees, they formally withdrew from representation. The high-priced legal shields that Gavin always boasted about had deserted him within 24 hours. They weren't willing to risk their professional reputations or spend their own resources defending a pair of bankrupt corporate criminals who were facing a guaranteed federal penitentiary sentence. The final phase of the collapse was entirely social. In our modern world, public humiliation doesn't stop at the courtroom doors. It bleeds into every corner of your daily existence. The extensive network of influential friends, local politicians, and high society associates who had spent years fighting for an invitation to Gavin's exclusive country club dinners vanished overnight. The very politicians who had accepted campaign donations from Sterling Development issued formal press releases condemning the corporate corruption, desperately trying to erase any public connection to the family. The brothers were completely isolated. The country club formally revoked their memberships. Their names were stripped from charity boards, and the local elite refused to answer their desperate phone calls from the holding facility. The social infrastructure they had spent their entire lives constructing to shield themselves from accountability had completely evaporated. They were no longer the untouchable kings of the county. They were pariahs, viewed as a toxic liability by everyone who had once smiled in their presence. As the sun began to set on the ruins of their empire, the true scope of my past intervention became undeniable. Gavin and Pierce were trapped inside a sterile detention facility, awaiting a trial where they had no money, no legal defense, and no allies left to buy their freedom. They had entered my property believing they could strike my daughter and walk away without a single consequence. Now they were sitting in a cold cell, realizing that their entire reality had been crushed because they underestimated the quiet old man living at the end of the road. The holding facility on the outskirts of the county was an architecture designed entirely to strip away human ego. There were no wood-paneled conference rooms, no leather chairs, and no deferential assistants waiting to handle Gavin's requests. Instead, there was only the monotonous hum of fluorescent lighting, the smell of industrial disinfectant, and the absolute finality of concrete block walls. Gavin sat at a stainless steel table inside a secure visitation booth, his fingers trembling violently as he gripped the heavy plastic receiver of the internal monitoring phone. Through Donovan's meticulous coordination, a direct encrypted patch had been established to this specific terminal, bypassing the standard bureaucratic limitations of the facility. Gavin didn't know who was on the other end of the line when the guard instructed him to pick up. He expected a public defender, a remaining business contact, or perhaps a desperate message from his brother Pierce down the hall. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep, and the manicured, pristine appearance he had maintained for years had completely dissolved into the hollow look of a trapped animal. When he pressed the receiver to his ear, he didn't hear a frantic attorney. He heard the calm, measured breathing of a man who was completely at peace. "Gavin," I said, my voice cutting through the static of the line with a terrifyingly familiar composure. He stiffened instantly, his knuckles turning white against the plastic phone. "Thomas?" he stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to summon a final pathetic shred of his former bravado. How are you calling this line? What do you want? If you're calling to gloat about my corporate legal troubles, you can save your breath. My family will sort this out by next week." I let out a soft, low chuckle that carried no warmth whatsoever. It was the sound of an operator watching an amateur finally realize they walked into an inescapable trap. "Your family isn't sorting anything out, Gavin," I said, my tone completely level, stripped of any anger, leaving only cold utility. "You don't have a corporate legal trouble. You have a systemic extinction event. Every bank account is locked. Every investor has fled. Your high-priced attorneys won't even accept your collect calls because they know your capital is completely gone. You are sitting in that cell with absolutely nothing, and you are going to stay there for a very long time." Gavin leaned forward against the stainless steel table, his breathing growing rapid and shallow as he tried to process the absolute certainty in my voice. This is just a routine regulatory audit," he lied, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his mounting terror. "It's a political hit job. It has nothing to do with you. You're just a retired old nobody living in a suburban tract house." "I told you before you left my driveway that you had no idea who I was," I replied, staring down at my calloused hands, the hands that had moved millions of dollars of illicit cargo through the Great Lakes region before he was even out of high school. "Do you really think a federal task force coincidentally descended on your estate exactly 20 minutes after you left my property? Do you think the media leaks, the asset seizures, and the instant collapse of your entire financial infrastructure were just a streak of bad luck?" The silence on the other end of the line became absolute. I could hear Gavin's ragged intake of air through the receiver as the pieces of the puzzle finally locked into place in his mind. The sheer impossibility of a simple retiree orchestrating a multi-agency federal raid vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that the old man he had struck on the porch was backed by a level of institutional power he couldn't even fathom. Who are you?" Gavin whispered, the last remnants of his corporate arrogance completely dying out, replaced by a deep primitive fear. "My identity doesn't matter anymore, Gavin," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, resonant tone that had once commanded the docks of Chicago. "The man I used to be died a long time ago so that my daughter could have a normal, peaceful life. I spent 15 years pretending to be gentle. I spent 15 years pruning roses, sweeping walkways, and letting people like you think they were superior, all to keep Chloe safe from the world I left behind." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over his cold cell. "You broke that peace," I continued, each syllable sharp and unyielding. "You walked onto my property, you raised your hand against my only child, and you thought your family's money made you untouchable. So, I reached back into the dark and brought a tiny piece of my old life out into the light just for you. The men who took your cars, the auditors who locked your accounts, the prosecutors who are drawing up your indictments. They don't answer to the local courts, Gavin. They answer to the people I used to protect." Through the receiver, I heard a broken, desperate gasp. Gavin was weeping now, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of his ruin completely crushed his spirit. The powerful executive who had stood so arrogantly on my concrete patio was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken boy who finally understood that he had crossed a line he could never return from. "Please," he choked out, his voice cracking completely. "Please, Thomas, tell them to stop. We can make a deal. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll leave the state. I'll give her whatever she wants. Just stop this." "The time for deals ended the second you put a bruise on her face," I said flatly. "You wanted to know who I am, Gavin. I am the man who took away everything you ever loved, and I did it without stepping a single foot outside my home. Look around that cell. That concrete room is your entire world now. Enjoy the silence." I cut the connection. The line went dead, leaving him alone in the sterile hum of the visitation booth. I lowered my phone, stepped out onto my front porch, and watched the evening sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the neighborhood was quiet once more, and inside the house, Chloe was finally safe. The debt had been collected, the empire had fallen, and the monsters knew exactly who I was. The legal dissolution of Chloe's marriage didn't arrive with the dramatic flair of a courtroom battle. It came in a plain manila envelope delivered to my kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday morning. Because Gavin's legal defense team had vanished and his assets remained entirely frozen by federal authorities, there was no one left to contest the filings. The paperwork was stark, sterile, and absolute. With a few brief signatures, the 3-year nightmare that had systematically eroded my daughter's spirit was officially terminated by the state of Georgia. I sat at the table, a mug of black coffee cooling between my palms, watching Chloe as she turned the pages. For the past several weeks, her recovery had been a fluctuating, fragile process. There were days when she could sit on the porch and enjoy the warmth of the sun, and there were nights when the sudden creak of a floorboard would cause her entire body to go completely rigid with panic. But as her eyes scanned the final decree, stamped with the official seal of the court, I witnessed a profound physical transformation take place right in front of me. Her shoulders, which had been perpetually hunched forward as if bracing for an impending blow, relaxed completely. She let out a long, slow breath, a deep, cleansing exhalation that felt like the first real pocket of air she had been allowed to take into her lungs in 36 months. The invisible weight of the Sterling name, along with the constant threat of their influence, had been officially lifted from her life. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the patter of the rain against the windowpane. She looked up at me, a tiny, genuine smile touching the corners of her lips for the first time in years. "He can't ever touch me again, Dad. The law says I am completely free." "The law is just catching up to reality, sweetheart," I said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You were free the moment you walked through my front door." The legal finality brought an undeniable sense of relief, but true emotional recovery does not operate on a judicial timeline. It moves slowly, like the steady growth of the oak trees lining our quiet coastal road. In the days that followed, the house took on a different rhythm. The frantic, hypervigilant energy that had consumed Chloe for years began to settle into a quiet, meditative stillness. She spent her afternoons cataloging her old art supplies, organizing charcoal pencils and sketchbooks that had remained completely untouched since the day she married Gavin. Yet as I watched her heal, a heavy, silent ache began to settle deep within my own chest. It was the crushing weight of fatherly guilt. I would sit on the porch in the early morning hours, looking out at the foggy Savannah marshlands, wondering how I had been so completely blind to her suffering. I had spent decades navigating the most treacherous, deceptive criminal landscapes in the country, reading the subtle shifts in an adversary's posture with absolute certainty. Yet, I had failed to see the quiet desperation hidden behind my own daughter's hollow smiles during our brief holiday dinners. "Dad," Chloe said one evening, stepping out onto the porch and breaking through my silent interrogation. She wrapped a thick knit blanket around her shoulders, sitting in the wicker chair beside me. "Stop doing that to yourself. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me." "I should have seen it, Chloe," I admitted, my voice dropping into a low, strained register. "I spent my entire life learning how to spot monsters, and I let one sit right at our table. I let you carry that weight alone for 3 years." "You didn't let me do anything," she said firmly, leaning over to rest her head against my shoulder. "I hid it from you because I knew exactly what you would do if you found out. I hid it to protect you, Dad, and when the time came, you saved me. That is the only thing that matters now." The decision to leave Savannah didn't come from a place of fear. It came from a mutual desire for a clean canvas. This city had become a repository of old ghosts, corporate scandals, and the lingering echoes of a conflict we were both ready to put behind us. We spent the final week packing our lives into cardboard boxes, stripping the small suburban house down to its bare walls. There was a therapeutic simplicity to the process. With every rolled layer of packing tape and every loaded crate, we were systematically locking away the remnants of a painful chapter. On our final morning, the southern humidity had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, brilliant blue sky. The moving truck stood idling in the driveway, fully loaded. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, checking the closets and ensuring the windows were securely locked. The house felt smaller now, stripped of its furniture, but it no longer held that dense, suffocating tension that had defined the afternoon Gavin arrived on our porch. I stepped outside and found Chloe standing by the passenger side of my sedan. She wasn't looking back at the house, nor was she looking toward the winding road that led back to the Sterling estate. She was looking straight ahead, her eyes clear, bright, and completely focused on the open highway. The dark bruising on her face had faded entirely, leaving behind only the radiant resilience of a woman who had survived the worst life could throw at her and emerged stronger for it. "Ready, Dad?" she asked, her voice steady and full of a quiet, unshakable optimism. "Ready, sweetheart," I replied, opening the driver's side door. I climbed inside, shifted the vehicle into drive, and slowly steered us away from the curb. As the trees of Savannah began to fade into the rearview mirror, I felt the final remnants of my own lingering guilt wash away, replaced by a profound, enduring peace. My old life in Chicago was buried forever. The Sterling Empire was nothing but a memory in the local archives, and the road ahead of us was entirely clear. For the first time in 3 long years, my daughter was truly beautifully free. The small coastal town we chose for our fresh start was completely devoid of grand estates, corporate logos, or historic family dynasties. It was a place defined by gray wooden piers, the scent of salt water, and residents who minded their own business. Our new cottage sat on a modest plot of sandy soil, surrounded by wild seagrass instead of manicured lawns. A few weeks after our arrival, once Chloe had settled into her new art studio at the back of the property, I sat alone on the small back porch as the evening tide began to roll in. The air was cool, carrying a sharp chill that felt remarkably clean. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted mobile device Donovan had provided. It was the last physical link to a world I had spent 15 years trying to forget, a world that had dismantled the Sterling family in a single afternoon. The screen glowed faintly in the gathering dusk, displaying the single unlisted contact act that held the keys to absolute institutional ruin. There was no hesitation in my movement. My thumb pressed down on the delete command, holding it until the software scrubbed the digital signature from the hardware entirely. Then, using a small pair of pliers from my pocket, I snapped the internal circuit board in half, listening to the clean metallic crunch. I walked down to the edge of the water and tossed the pieces far out into the dark waves. The water swallowed them instantly. The bridge was officially burned. Donovan understood the terms of our arrangement. The marker had been paid in full, the debt was settled, and my temporary return to the shadows was officially over. I was no longer an operator, a strategist, or an architect of corporate destruction. I was just an old man with dirt under his fingernails, standing on a quiet shore, listening to the wind. Walking back up the sandy path to the cottage, I looked at my hands. They were steady now, entirely free of the tremor that had plagued them during the intense confrontation in Savannah. But I knew what those hands were capable of executing when the thin veneer of civilian life was stripped away. Violence, I reflected, is not a switch you simply turn on and off without a cost. It is an infection. Even when it is completely justified, even when it is unleashed to protect the person you love most in the world, it leaves a dark, indelible stain on your soul. I had spent decades watching men get consumed by that darkness, believing that their capacity for destruction made them invincible. Gavin and Pierce Sterling had fallen into that exact same trap, mistaking their corporate influence and physical aggression for true strength. They didn't understand that real power doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to threaten, and it certainly doesn't need to validate itself by striking those who appear defenseless. Inside the cottage, the soft, warm light of the kitchen window revealed Chloe sitting at her easel, her brush moving across a canvas with a fluid, unhurried grace. She was no longer looking over her shoulder. The hypervigilance that had stolen her youth was gone, replaced by the deep, meditative focus of a true creator. Watching her, I knew that every single action I had taken was entirely worth the moral weight I now carried. I had used the darkness one final time to secure her light, ensuring that the legacy of my past would end with me, buried deep beneath the waves. The world thinks that the most dangerous men are the ones who wear their malice openly, the loud executives, the violent enforcers, the arrogant operators who command attention when they walk into a room. But they are completely wrong. The truly dangerous individuals are the ones who have deliberately chosen to step out of the arena, the ones who have traded their weapons for garden shears and their networks for a quiet porch. They are the men who know exactly what it takes to tear down an empire, yet consciously choose to pick up a broom instead. If the Sterling brothers had bothered to look closely at the history of the world they tried to exploit, they would have realized a fundamental truth about human nature. The world is full of fragile systems, artificial titles, and temporary fortunes that can be completely erased in less than an hour. A name on a corporate building doesn't protect you from the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. And a bank account cannot buy safety when a true professional decides your time is officially up. I took one last look out at the dark horizon, where the sea completely dissolved into the night sky. The past was right where it belonged, buried so deep that no amount of money, investigation, or institutional authority could ever dredge it back to the surface. Gavin and Pierce learned that lesson in the absolute worst way possible. And they would have the next 20 years in a concrete cell to think about the quiet gardener they had underestimated. I turned my back on the ocean, opened the screen door, and stepped back into the warmth of the cottage, leaving the shadows behind for good. People often wonder how quiet, unremarkable men manage to live such peaceful lives in the wake of absolute chaos. The answer is incredibly simple, and it is a warning that every arrogant tyrant should remember. Before old men become old, they survive dangerous years.